Welcome to the OK, Let's Learn podcast, where we dive into books, stories, people, and tons of different topics. My name is Kevin O'Keefe, and today, let's learn about the Spartans. And no, I'm not talking about the Michigan State Spartans. I'm not talking about my hometown Spack and Kill High School Spartans. And no, I know there's lots of you out there from the Colorado Northwestern Community College. No, not those Spartans. We're talking about the Spartans from ancient Greece, the famous city-state of Sparta. So we will dive into everything that you wanted to know from A to Z, from the beginnings to present day, but primarily we will focus on the classical period of ancient Greece when Sparta was not only getting together with Athens to fight off the Persians, but when they were fighting against Athens and ultimately their decline. They have a fascinating history in terms of how they lived, who they were, their belief system, everything we will dive in. So, okay, let's learn. The beginnings of ancient Sparta go back to the end of the Bronze Age, around 1200 BC. Sparta as a city-state, this is where it all began. And everything around this time period is wrapped in an enigma. It's all mysterious. But we do know it came from these people known as the Dorians. They came south into the Peloponnesian Peninsula, which is southern Greece. Around the same time, there were up to seven big empires in this whole area surrounding the Mediterranean Sea. And there were these people known as the Sea People, who came in and destroyed everything within one lifetime, one generation. Boys and girls, we're talking about 30, 40 years. All of these unbelievably big empires disappeared. They were gone. And we really don't know how and really who these sea people were, but they destroyed everything in their path. Cities completely wiped off the map. Writing systems gone. And trade halted and stopped. We're talking about big empires at the time. We're talking about present-day Greece. And who controlled this area at this time? The Mycenaeans. They disappeared. The Hittites in present-day Turkey, northern Syria, gone. The Canaanite city-states, present-day Syria, Levant, Lebanon, Israel, Palestine, Jordan. And there's more. The Kassites, which was the Babylonian Empire at the time, present-day Iraq, the Minoans, their civilization, the island of Crete. And yes, the Syrians, again, present-day Iraq, Syria, southeastern Turkey, but the biggie, even the new kingdom of Egypt at the time, all disappeared. So this was the vacuum. This was the time period that ancient Sparta came into being. And it was originally from these people known as the Dorians that settled into the present-day area that we have come to know as Sparta, and Sparta is still on the map today. And a couple more points before we dive into the Spartans that's important to know for everyone here. We're talking about little archaeological evidence. We're talking about no writing that has actually survived from this period. So what actually happened? These sea people, right? Were they 100% responsible? Clearly there's some logical understanding that they were responsible. They were almost like Vikings. But there could have been a huge drought. There could have been huge earthquakes at the time. Something else happened that all these civilizations ultimately disappeared? And also, especially for boys and girls, historians break up the past into specific ages. The first is the Stone Age, and that's from approximately 3.5 million years ago to about 3000 BC. Then the Bronze Age began, and that lasted until about this time period. We're talking about 1200 BC. The beginning of the classical period, when we're talking about the Spartans, begins towards the end of this next age called the Iron Age, which is approximately 1200 BC to around 500 BC. This is when the Spartans were part of history, and everything we know about them is around this time period, beginning around 600 BC, when they became a real military power. So believe it or not, we talk about the modern age. And yes, it's been a long time, but we talk about the modern age beginning around 500 BC to the present day. And why is it that historians talk about the modern time starting? Well, it's all about written records and everything being able to go back to facts and proof, because everything was primary sources, which is the original people that lived during the time, and these writings survived. Why do they call it the Stone Age, the Bronze Age, and the Iron Age? As you can probably guess, boys and girls, it all comes down to the metals that were used primarily during that time, the tools that human beings used. Stones, that's all they used during that time period, to make tools, to basically survive, everything. Yes, and then bronze came along. And it's important, boys and girls, to know that bronze was this new, harder material that made life so much easier. But bronze actually was something that came about and was, quote, invented, because bronze is a combination of copper and tin. And then from that point, this new metal emerged, which was iron, that was even stronger than bronze, and that was able to push civilization forward. One more point, this idea about AD and BC. Boys and girls, especially for you, AD refers to Anno Domini, which is the year of the Lord. BC means before Christ. Our calendar is set up where the past is broken up to before Christ was born and after Christ was born. So I'll be referring to the dates as AD or BC. But please understand that historians and a lot of people refer to AD now as being CE, which means the Common Era. And BC is referred to as BCE, before the Common Era. Historians and people today refer to this new way of talking about our past because it's more inclusive and it's less religious based. So I hope all that made sense, especially for our younger audience. But let's dive into the Spartans. So it was about 500 years or so after the disappearance of all of these empires, around 750 BC, where the Spartans took over the Mysian population. This was just to the west of present-day Sparta, where there was lots of fertile land, and the immediate areas to the north and the east was Lacona. Now, it's here where the Spartan life, their existence, everything about their future, this was the foundation. And it started with something awful. When they took over the land, they took over the people. This wasn't unique for ancient times, but the Spartans dramatically had their foundation, their civilization based on slaves. For every 8 slaves, there was only 1 Spartan. The state distributed the land and gave it to the Spartans. All the slaves made up almost 80% of the entire population. The Spartans, the people who could vote, the people who then were in the military, they didn't even make up 10% of the population. And the rest, up to 15%, were these people that were free, but they could not vote. They were mostly merchants and craftsmen, sailors. These people were known as the Parokois, and the Spartans were the Spartiates. So everything I'm going to talk about now all comes from primarily four historians. And the first three, Herodotus, he wrote about the history of the Persian Wars. Thucydides, he wrote about the wars between Athens and Sparta. Xenophon, same situation. All three of them basically lived shortly after all these events happened, and actually during their lifetimes. But also Plutarch, who lived almost, 500 years later? He lived during the Roman Empire. He wasn't Greek. He wasn't around during the time. So all these years passed, and this is where we're getting a lot of the information. So while historians do understand that most of these events are authentic, and this is how we have come to know all of this, you do need to understand that they were not Spartans. Spartan was a closed society. They did not pass down information with historical written records. It was mostly oral traditions. And so who wrote the histories? Their enemies, Athenians. They were all Athenians, except for Plutarch, who lived, like I said, centuries later. So again, take some of this with a jaded view that, it may not be that authentic. And we'll touch on this as we go along. The person that started it all was this gentleman by the name of Lycurgus. He was a Spartan warrior, a Spartan general, and he set up the system that we all know today. And yes, it was all about the state being more important than the family. It was all about being strong, being a warrior, being simple, austere, not flamboyant or rich. Lycurgus actually instituted that the monies would be iron bars instead of gold and silver coins, specifically because they wanted their society to be, again, focused on the state. He actually said, hey, a city is well fortified when it has a wall of men instead of brick. So not only was it a closed society, they frowned upon moving out, getting to know other city-states, traveling, trading. This was opposed to Athens, their contemporary, their enemy, and in some cases, they work with them, but they had a specific way of living. So, number one, this actually happened when you were 7 years old. You would leave the family, and the mothers would say, when you come back with a shield or come back on a shield. This was understood. This was expected. You went to something that was called the agoge. And actually, we pronounce it really here in English today, the agoge. This was a military school that you were sent to if you were a boy, and you spent all of the next 13 years until you were 20 learning how to fight, learning how to be a warrior. You were given very little clothes. You were almost expected to sleep, not on a bed, but on a floor. You were expected to go hungry. You were given very little food. Why? To prepare you for battle, to prepare you for the situation that you're going to need to survive out on the battlefield. You were encouraged to steal. You were encouraged to be a bully. You were thrown out there, given little food, and the strongest would survive. Now, the children were educated in other areas. It wasn't all about how to be a warrior. And the women were encouraged as well to constantly exercise, be fit, be strong. And remember, their society was unique because they had so many slaves. Their job, the zealots, their job was to farm the land, do pretty much all of the housework. So the husbands, they were very rarely around. They came home maybe at night, once, twice a week, because they were out at the military schools, the agoge, helping to train the next generation of warriors, all of their sons. And they spent all their time together, all the men, all the boys. They were together in what they called messes, which was a communal type of living where they would literally sit down at a table and eat together every night to establish this camaraderie, to establish this warrior ethos, mindset. Even to the point when boys were born, they were brought to the elders of Sparta. And this has been told through the generations, through the centuries, that they would actually be thrown off a cliff. Not true. The understanding today with most historians, again, because of this bias written by Athenians, and then later on with Plutarch, who lived, like I said, centuries later, maybe this happened in certain isolated situations, but they believe that this is mostly a myth. What was not a myth is that the zealots constantly were looking to uprise and take over their masters. So there was a constant focus for the ruling class to keep the slaves, the zealots, in line. And this became really the downfall of the entire Spartan society in existence. This way of life just could not be sustained. Frankly, because as the years went on, there was more and more zealots and less of the Spartans. So who ran the government? Uniquely, there were two kings. And this was different than most of the city-states at the time. These kings also went off into battle. They were known as generals at the time. And there were 28 people underneath them in a council. And you had to be 60 years old to be in the government. And finally, there were these 5 judges known as ephors. They were elected every year, and they had a lot of power over these two kings. They went off into battle with them, and they had the authority to actually exile, fine, and actually put these kings on trial. So at the top, you had a bunch of different checks on the power of the kings. So while it wasn't a democracy, it also wasn't a monarchy. There were a small number of people that were in charge, but it wasn't just one person. A few more nuggets about the ancient Spartans. Number one, they had this black soup, black broth. And again, it's important to remember this came from mostly the Athenians. I can't imagine that this horrible soup was despised by everyone in Sparta, but nevertheless, according to legend, it was made from pig's blood, vinegar, and salts. The Spartan warriors, the boys, they were expected to walk around bare feet. The way they spoke was different than, again, their contemporaries, the Athenians, where Athenians were known clearly for their philosophers and thinking a lot, but speaking, there was this idea that you want to be short, sweet, to the point, and powerful. Less words were better. I mentioned this before, but there was a focus on staying put in Sparta, not traveling, not moving around to other city-states. They had long hair, the warriors, and for over 300 and 400 years, from 300 to about 370 BC, they were the kings on the battlefield, especially their army, as opposed to, again, the Athenians that would specialize as sailors. The Spartan warriors, many of them had long hair to have this fierce kind of look, and they had a reputation for never surrendering, which we will talk about in future episodes. The famous film 300 was based on 300 Spartan warriors not giving up at the famous Battle of Thermopylae. So to wrap up our episode on the Spartans, it's important to know that their dominance, although it started with the vacuum of the Sea People and the Dorians coming in around 800 BC or so, their dominance basically ended a short time later. We're talking about 500 years or so. 371 BC, they were defeated by Thebes, another city-state, and this came about primarily because they were just so tired and they were so beaten down with so many wars through the years, and obviously with a lot of the people in this society not being Spartans. Very few of the ruling class, like I said, 10%, and it became less and less as the years went on. It wasn't sustainable. So to summarize the years that they were in power, we're talking about early on when they got together with Athens to fight against Persia. Then the Spartans ended up, unfortunately, spending so much time fighting in the Peloponnesian Wars against Athens. This is the primary reason that their society as a whole just broke down and they weren't as powerful. They were just beaten up. So while they continued as a actual functioning shadow of itself city-state, their independence and their history was gone in 146 BC. Why? Because that was when the Romans took them over. But why are we talking about them still today? Because so much of what we live in, our culture, goes back to this time period because the Romans kept, through their language, the Latin language, assimilated into their language, assimilated into their culture and their way of life. They implemented so many of the Greek traditions. And yes, most of them came from Athens, no doubt. But this particular time period, this particular city-state became so famous because of what it did throughout this time period, and the image lives on. And yes, Sparta is still there today. It became nothing but a small little town, but by royal decree in 1834, King Otto of Greece created the town and the city that we know today. 30,000 people throughout Sparta, with apparently about 17,000 in the actual city. Mostly agricultural based. Apparently there's a lot of business with fruits, citrus fruits, and olive oil. And it's actually like a little college town with the University of Peloponnese being there. So I have a friend who's actually family on her mother's side is from Sparta. So while it's clearly a tourist destination site, there's not that many archaeological remnants of the past, buildings from the past, like Athens. It's actually almost the opposite, and mostly in the north side of present-day Sparta. So let's wrap up our podcast with the top 10 most interesting facts of the Spartans. Number 10, which we haven't talked about, but definitely a future episode. At the Battle of Marathon, which was a huge battle where the Athenians beat back the Persians, the Spartans were supposed to help, but they didn't get there in time. Number 9, yes, a future episode again, the Battle of Thermopylae, which we didn't go into details on, but just know that 300 Spartans ended up helping the Athenians ultimately again beat the Persians. Number 8, the history of the Spartans were written for the most part years later by Athenians and not necessarily the actual first-hand account from the Spartans. Number 7, yeah, apparently they threw some babies off a cliff that weren't real, healthy babies, but it's understood today, mostly a myth. Number 6, the men, the boys, spent time together eating in what they called a mess. Up to 15 men and boys spent all their time together. Number 5, there were kings, 2 of them, and there were these 5 judges that ruled over the society. 4, the beginning of Sparta came about from the Dorians who came into this area, but it only ended up becoming a reality because of the invasion of the Sea People at the end of the Bronze Age, where one of 7 kingdoms pretty much just disappeared, and that was the Mysians. Number 3, the whole Spartan society was based on slavery. 80% of the population were helots, They were the slaves. They were the ones that farmed their lands. They were the ones that took care of the household. And yes, because there were so many of them, that ultimately this is what brought down the society as a whole, constantly trying to keep them in line. And at the end, this system of a society just wasn't able to survive. Number 2, it was all about this agoge. The boys, where they were trained to be soldiers, they were taught to steal, they were taught to be bullies, they were taught how to survive. And how did they do that? By not giving them any clothes, by not giving them any food, and by having them sleep on the floor. Yes, I'm exaggerating to a certain extent here, but life was not easy for a young man growing up in Sparta, but they became tough warriors. And number 1, the most interesting fact about ancient Sparta, the boys were sent off to military school, the agoge, at age 7. And it was supported. Mothers supported it. The whole society expected it. And the ideal about the Spartan warrior was such that if you came home with your shield, or you came home on it. If you came home on it, you had passed away honorably by fighting. And it was not accepted that that shield did not come home, because that was as if you didn't fight, you deserted your comrades, and you weren't considered a Spartan warrior. And as we wrap up, again, where did this come from? From Plutarch all those years ago. Whether it happened, who knows if it was actually a quote said, but it represented the ideal of a Spartan soldier. Thanks for staying with me all this episode. This has been Okay, Let's Learn about the Spartans. Reach out to me at kevmok21@gmail.com. Questions, comments, anything I got right, anything I got wrong. Feedback is always appreciated. And if you could give me a nice review on Apple Podcast, a 5-star rating, always appreciated. So until next time, have fun and keep learning.